Look at him, 42 years old and still begging for scraps at his own family's table. The words hit like a hammer, loud enough to hush the clink of glasses and the shuffle of silverware. Laughter rippled around the dining room, the kind that stings more than it amuses because it isn't joy, it's mockery. My cousin Drew leaned back in his chair, grinning wide, his voice carrying across the Thanksgiving spread like he owned every face in the room. Bystanders smirked, even some I thought were on my side, but the one who mattered, my daughter, Emily, sat frozen, eyes darting to me as if she'd just watched her father stripped bare in public. Her small fork trembled against her plate. And that was the moment the floor dropped from under me. My name is Michael Harris. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Dayton, Ohio. I've worked my ass off for decades, juggling debts, jobs, and promises I could barely keep, but I'll say this. I keep my head down and I don't forget what people owe me. That's the one advantage they don't see yet. The thing I've been holding in reserve like a card I'll only play once. Drew smirked, sipping from his beer bottle as if he hadn't just gutted me in front of my child. Maybe if you'd worked as hard as you brag about, Mike, you wouldn't be crashing at your brother's house for the holidays. The table erupted again, and I could smell the stuffing, the turkey skin, the cranberry sauce. It all turned sour in my throat. My brother Tom didn't step in, of course. His silence was permission, and Drew knew it. That's what stung. Not just the humiliation, but the betrayal of blood allowing it to happen. I glanced at Emily, her lips pressed tight, trying not to cry. That look in her eyes, confusion, shame, the desperate plea for me to do something, was enough to dig nails into my palms under the table. And then my gaze caught on the dish at the center of the table. Grandma's cornbread, baked from her old recipe, the one tradition my mother swore bound this family tighter than blood. We only made it on holidays, thick, golden, cracked at the top, with butter melting down its sides. As a kid, I used to fight for the first piece. Tonight, Drew had grabbed it first and torn it in half like it was his to own. A flash of heat went through me. Cornbread. Who the hell thinks about cornbread in the middle of humiliation? But I did. Because something about it felt like the hinge between who we used to be and what we'd become. I could feel my pulse hammering in my neck, the weight of every glance pressing on me. The smart move would have been to swallow it, pretend it didn't matter. But pride doesn't work like that. Pride is a blade that cuts deeper the more you try to hide it. Funny, I finally said, my voice low but clear enough to reach him. I don't remember you working for anything you've got. Drew tilted his head, his smile faltering for a split second, then snapping back, sharper now, fueled by the attention. He leaned closer across the table. What's that supposed to mean? I wanted to tell him everything. The lies he told about his business, the shortcuts, the fake stories he fed everyone about being self-made. But that would have been too soon, and I wasn't ready to show my hand. Instead, I let silence answer for me, because silence can choke louder than words. And I saw it then, the twitch at the corner of his eye, the quick glance to see who might have caught it. That was the first crack. Dinner pressed on, but the air was heavy. I barely tasted a thing. I caught fragments of conversation, football scores, travel plans, Aunt Linda bragging about her new car, but it all blurred under the static in my skull. Emily didn't touch her plate. She just stared at me like she was waiting for me to save her from the embarrassment of being my daughter. That cut deeper than Drew ever could. Because humiliation in front of strangers you can survive, humiliation in front of your child brands you. Tom finally raised a toast, awkwardly trying to shift the mood. To family, he said, lifting his glass. But even his voice lacked conviction. The glasses clinked, but there was no warmth, no unity. Just thin crystal and hollow words. When plates cleared and people drifted toward the living room, Drew brushed past me, whispering low enough so no one else could hear. Face it, Mike. You'll never catch up. You'll always be 2 steps behind. He didn't wait for me to respond, just walked off with that smug stride, owning the space like he'd won. I stood there, fists heavy, heart heavier, staring at the crumbs of cornbread still stuck to the serving plate. It wasn't the first time Drew humiliated me, but it was the first time he did it in front of Emily. That changed everything. There are wounds you take in silence, but when someone makes your child bleed by proxy, when they poison her pride in you, you stop being patient. You start planning. I felt Emily slip her small hand into mine, squeezing tight. She didn't say a word, but the way she looked at me, pleading, hurting, lit a fuse I knew I couldn't put out. I whispered to her, "It's all right, sweetheart," though it wasn't. Not yet. Not until I made it right. And that's when the idea began to form, vague but sharp enough to slice. Not revenge. Not yet, but a seed. I had something Drew didn't know about, something I'd been holding back for years. I thought of it like a receipt, a proof of purchase that one day would demand payment. And tonight, watching Emily's trembling lip, I knew the time was coming. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Later, as the family gathered in the living room to watch football, I slipped onto the porch, cold November air biting at my face. The sound of laughter inside grated like sandpaper, but out here, under the dim porch light, I could breathe. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an email alert from work, subject line, contract update urgent. I opened it, scanning, my pulse quickening as the words leapt out at me. A technicality, a clause Drew had overlooked. He tied his latest venture to a handshake promise, not realizing the fine print was written differently. For the first time that night, I smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just the kind of smile you hide in the dark when you realize the tide is about to shift. Because humiliation is temporary. But leverage is permanent. And that's where it began. Not with a scream, not with a fist through drywall, but with a quiet spark I carried back inside as if it were just another secret. The game was on, everyone crowded around the TV, faces lit by blue light and beer bottles gleaming on the coffee table. Drew was in the middle, of course, gesturing big, telling a story that had the room chuckling. He had the gift of holding attention, but only because no one else was willing to fight for it. I sank into a corner of the couch, Emily curled at my side, and I forced myself to watch his hands as he spoke broad, careless sweeps, like he owned the air he cut through. Tom came by with another beer for me, setting it on the end table. He didn't meet my eyes, just muttered, "Don't take it personal, Mike. You know how Drew is." That line hit harder than Drew's jab, because it meant Tom knew. He knew what was happening and chose the easy road anyway. Family, they always said, is who you bleed for. But what they never admit is that sometimes it's family holding the knife. I cracked open the bottle, foam fizzing over the rim. The first sip was bitter, not from the hops, but from the humiliation I could still taste in my throat. Emily leaned closer, whispering, "Dad, can we go home?" And there it was, that twist of shame, sharper than the laughter had been. When your child asks to leave family behind, you realize something's broken that can't be glued back with holiday wishes. But I stayed, because leaving would have meant Drew won. And I wasn't ready to let him win. Not yet. Commercial break. Drew scrolled his phone, chuckling. "Hey, look at this," he said, and suddenly he was reading something out loud, a screenshot of an old group text. One where I'd vented months ago about struggling to keep my job afloat. My private words, dragged into the open, twisted for laughs. "Listen to Mike here. Feels like I'm drowning, paycheck to paycheck. Man, no wonder you can't get a break." He held up the phone so everyone could see, and a wave of smirks spread like wildfire. Emily turned her face into my sleeve. My ears rang hot. He'd saved it. He'd kept my lowest moment, tucked it away, waiting for the perfect chance to use it like a blade. And he chose tonight, in front of her. Something inside me steadied then. Not anger, not even humiliation, but clarity. A realization that Drew thrived on performance, on spectacle, on dragging others into his theater of control. And if theater was the stage, then there was always an audience. Audiences could turn. Audiences could be redirected. I let him laugh. I let them all laugh. But in my head, a voice whispered, "If they use your words as weapons, learn to make their weapons backfire." Drew tossed his phone onto the table, still grinning, but I caught the flicker in his eyes. He wanted me to explode. He wanted me to lose it so he could own not just the joke, but the fallout. I didn't give him that. Instead, I leaned back, took another sip of beer, and said calmly, "Funny thing about drowning, it teaches you how to breathe deeper than anyone else." The room shifted, subtle but real. A few chuckles died. Aunt Linda raised an eyebrow. Drew's smile faltered half an inch, because I hadn't broken. I'd given them something quotable, something sharp enough to sound like wisdom. That's when I realized a truth I'd never put into words before. Humiliation only lasts as long as you let them write the ending. Take back the pen, and suddenly they're the ones waiting for applause. Still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. My phone buzzed again. Another email, another detail in that contract. I couldn't dive in here, not in the open, but I scanned just enough to know I had a foothold. A tiny clause about liability and ownership, something Drew had no idea was stacked against him. It was like spotting a crack in a dam. Pressure builds. One touch at the right moment, and everything bursts. The game blared, touchdown cheers filled the room, but I couldn't focus. All I could see was Emily sitting stiff beside me, her small hands clenched. I bent close, whispering, "We'll be all right. Trust me." She looked up, doubtful, but nodded slowly. That nod was gasoline poured on the fire in my chest. Later, in the kitchen, I found Drew alone, tearing another chunk of Grandma's cornbread, shoving it into his mouth like he was feeding on history itself. He caught my stare and smirked with crumbs stuck to his lip. "What? You want some?" He shoved the rest into his mouth, talking through the chew. "You had your chance at the table. Guess you're late to everything." I didn't answer. Didn't need to. The cornbread was no longer just bread. It was a symbol of tradition, of respect, of what he'd stolen piece by piece while everyone else let him. And I knew then that when the time came, it wouldn't just be Drew losing money, reputation, pride. It would be him choking on the very thing he used to mock me. For the rest of the night, I played the part. I laughed when needed, nodded when addressed, poured drinks like a good brother should. But inside, the seed had grown into a plan. Not clear yet, but sharp enough to cut through doubt. As coats went on and the night wound down, Drew clapped me on the back harder than necessary. "Good to see you, Mike. Don't be a stranger. And hey, next year, maybe you'll be the one hosting." He winked, as if to remind me that even his kindness was just another humiliation. I smiled thin, holding Emily's coat for her. "Maybe I will," I said. Outside, cold air filled my lungs, crisp and bitter. Emily climbed into the car, silent, her breath fogging the window. I sat behind the wheel, staring at the house glowing warm with laughter and light. And I made a promise to myself, to her, to every piece of me Drew had tried to shatter. A promise that the next time we gathered, it wouldn't be me swallowing humiliation. It would be him. And the first step was already in motion, though I hadn't yet drawn the map in full, just traced its outline on the back of my mind. Back home, long after Emily had gone to bed, I sat in the glow of my laptop, scrolling through contracts until my eyes burned. The clause was there, buried in legal jargon, a line about liability tied to ownership transfers. Drew had registered his venture under a temporary entity, not realizing the transfer hadn't finalized. Which meant, by state law, any deals he'd bragged about at the table weren't binding to him, they were still binding to me. To me, I whispered it like a secret prayer. Drew thought he was ahead, but he'd built his empire on paperwork he never bothered to read. The screen flickered, the cursor blinking like a pulse. My chest tightened as I thought about the risk. If I played it wrong, I'd look like the bitter cousin trying to drag him down. If I played it right, I could take everything he'd mocked me with, and no one would see it coming. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. Doubt crept in. Was I really ready to turn family into prey? The image of Emily at the table, her fork trembling, answered for me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about correction. Some debts don't vanish with time, they accrue interest. The next day at work, I printed every document, slid them into a plain manila folder, and locked it in my desk. Co-workers passed by, nodding hellos, oblivious. I envied them, the simplicity of people untouched by betrayal. But then I caught my reflection in the glass partition, tired eyes, stubble rougher than usual, and I told myself, if you let people walk over you, don't be surprised when they leave footprints on your face. At lunch, I sat in my car, scrolling through Drew's social media. He was already posting photos from Thanksgiving selfies with Tom, boomerangs of toasts, captions dripping with family pride. Not a trace of me, not a single shot of Emily. We'd been erased, cropped out like afterthoughts. My jaw tightened as I read the comments. Friends praising his success, women fawning over his charm. And then, one photo caught my eye, a shot of him holding up a slice of Grandma's cornbread, captioned, "Some traditions you don't mess with." I almost laughed. Almost, because he had no idea how right he was. That night, I called an old friend from college, Brian Miller, now a lawyer in Cincinnati. We hadn't spoken in years, but betrayal has a way of stripping pride. I laid it out in vague terms. A family business dispute, I called it, and asked him to double-check my read of the contract. There was a pause on the line, papers rustling, his voice low. "Mike." He screwed himself. "You're the legal owner until the transfer clears." "Anything he's signing right now?" Liability's on you, but so is control. Control. The words slid through me like whiskey, warm and dangerous. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence. Control wasn't just paperwork. Control was narrative. Drew wanted the audience, but I had the script. All I had to do was decide when to flip the pages. The weeks that followed were a dance of shadows. Drew bragged louder online, throwing up pictures of new deals, new partners. I stayed silent, quietly collecting everything: screenshots of his posts, copies of receipts, text threads where he boasted about contracts he hadn't legally secured. Every piece went into the folder, thickening with proof. But the closer I got, the heavier the paranoia grew. At night, I'd wake to creaks in the house, convinced Drew somehow knew I was digging under his foundation. At work, I flinched whenever my phone buzzed, half expecting his name. Once, Tom called, casual as ever, but I heard Drew's voice laughing in the background, and my knuckles went white gripping the phone. Doubt gnawed at me. What if I was overreaching? What if the technicality backfired? But then I'd see Emily at the kitchen table, doing homework, humming softly, her hair falling in her eyes, and I'd remember her whisper, "Can we go home?" Home wasn't walls or roofs. Home was dignity. And Drew had tried to strip ours. One night, sorting through the folder, I found myself staring at the cornbread photo again. The crumbs on his plate, his smug grin frozen in pixels. I'd printed it, slid it into the folder as the final page. Not because it was evidence, but because it was prophecy. A reminder of what this all meant. I kept hearing my father's voice, long dead but stubborn in memory. Revenge is like fire. You better build a chimney before you light it, or it'll burn you with the house. But what he never said, what I was learning now, was that sometimes the house is already burned, and revenge is the only warmth left. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Drew announced a Christmas party at his downtown condo, big enough to pack with friends, family, business partners. He sent the invite to everyone, even me, probably expecting me to decline to stay in my corner licking wounds. IRSVPD, yes. Because nothing tastes sharper than surprise served cold. In the days leading up, I prepared quietly. Printed contracts, highlighted clauses, stapled proof. Brian had confirmed every angle. Drew had left himself wide open. He'd even signed agreements with partners that contradicted each other. All it would take was one spotlight and the golden boy would unravel, but fear still pressed in. The closer I came to pulling the trigger, the more I wondered if I'd lose myself in the process. Could I destroy him without destroying the last fragile threads of family that tied Emily to her cousins, to her uncle? Or was that already gone the night Tom let me bleed at the table? The night of the party, I dressed sharp black blazer, pressed shirt, shoes polished enough to see reflections. Emily stayed with her mother that weekend, safe from what was about to unfold. As I drove downtown, headlights cutting through snow flurries, my chest tightened not from guilt, but from anticipation. My folder sat on the passenger seat like a loaded gun. When I stepped into Drew's condo, the warmth hit me, lights strung across windows, music low, laughter already thick in the air. Drew spotted me immediately, surprise flickering before he plastered on that trademark grin. Well, look who showed up. Thought you'd be too busy drowning. I smiled back, calm, steady. Funny thing about drowning, I said, echoing my own words from Thanksgiving. It teaches you how to wait until everyone else runs out of breath. For a flicker of a second, his grin wavered. And I knew the noose was tightening. I let him lead me toward the crowd, his hand heavy on my shoulder like he was still the master of ceremonies, still in control, still untouchable. But the folder under my arm weighed more than his whole performance. Music thumped, glasses clinked, and the air buzzed with warmth and wine. But all I felt was the pulse in my neck and the razor-edge calm of knowing a blade was about to drop. Drew raised his glass high, voice booming across the room. To family, to success, to another year of hard work paying off. Applause, laughter, cheers. He loved the theater of it, but theater works both ways. I waited for the lull, for the moment eyes drifted, and then I cleared my throat. Speaking of hard work, I said, my voice carrying just enough, you might want to thank the people who actually carry your weight. Heads turned, conversations stilled. Drew blinked, still smiling, though tighter now. What's that supposed to mean, Mike? I held up the folder, not dramatic, just matter of fact. It means all those contracts you've been bragging about, they're not yours. Not legally. According to state law, they're still mine. I pulled out the papers, highlighted sections glowing under the condo lights. Murmurs rippled. A few people leaned closer. Business partners craned their necks, their smiles fading. Drew laughed, too loud. You don't know what you're talking about. I slid the printed screenshots across the table, a thread of his texts boasting about deals, photos of him signing with partners while liability still tied to me. Gasps, whispers, one of the investors snatching the papers, scanning them with wide eyes. This voids everything, one of them muttered. We're exposed. Drew's face reddened, his charm cracking like glass under pressure. This is bullshit. He shouted, but I was already pulling out my phone. The screen lit up with a live video stream, every word, every contract, every stunned reaction broadcast to a private group of investors. And in that moment, I saw the shift. Drew wasn't the golden boy anymore. He was the fraud caught in his own spotlight. He lunged toward me, but someone grabbed his arm, holding him back. The room had turned, and he knew it. His voice cracked with desperation. Mike, you wouldn't do this. We're family. Family, the word curdled in my chest. Family doesn't keep receipts of your lowest moments just to humiliate you in front of your daughter, I said, voice low but cutting. Family doesn't eat the bread of tradition just to spit crumbs in your face. I reached into the folder and pulled out the final page, the photo of him holding Grandma's cornbread like a trophy. I held it up for everyone to see. This is what he does, I said. He takes what doesn't belong to him and calls it tradition. But tradition isn't his to own. Respect isn't his to eat. Tonight he chokes on both. And then I did what I'd been waiting for. I pulled out the small covered dish I'd brought with me, unwrapped it, and set it on the table. Grandma's cornbread, baked from the same recipe, golden and cracked. Just like always. Gasps rose half in recognition, half in disbelief. I cut a piece, placed it on a plate, slid it in front of Drew. Go on, I said. Take the first bite. Like you did at Thanksgiving. His face twisted. He refused, of course, but the silence was worse than compliance. Everyone watched. Everyone understood. The cornbread was no longer food. It was judgment. It was history. It was justice in the form of something he'd mocked me with, and by refusing it, he admitted everything. One of the investors slammed the papers onto the counter. We're out, he barked. Others nodded, already gathering coats, muttering about lawsuits and damages. Phones buzzed, messages flying. Drew's empire was collapsing in real time, the room that once adored him, now treating him like contagion. He turned back to me, eyes wild. You think you've won? You think this makes you a man? I leaned close, low enough only he could hear. No, this makes me even. Being a man will come after when I walk my daughter into the world knowing she doesn't have to be ashamed of me. He trembled, jaw tight, but words failed him. The crowd dispersed, whispers chasing each other like shadows. Someone had already uploaded the confrontation. The video was spreading faster than wine spills on carpet. Drew would wake tomorrow to his name trending for all the wrong reasons. As the condo emptied, I stood alone with the cornbread cooling between us. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. He'd already choked on it without taking a bite. When I finally stepped into the cold night, snowflakes catching in my hair, I felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Revenge doesn't fill you, it empties you. But sometimes the emptiness is cleaner than the rot you carried before. I walked to my car, folder under my arm, and thought about the philosophy I'd learned too late, but just in time to act. Justice isn't about striking back. It's about making sure the echo of your pain finally lands in the right ears. And as I drove through the quiet streets, headlights sweeping across shuttered diners and snow-dusted lawns, I realized the lesson was simple enough to carry home. In America, family can break you faster than strangers, but dignity is the one inheritance you can't afford to lose. And if someone tries to steal it, you take it back piece by piece until they choke on every crumb. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.